Modern steel can snap faster than iron made 500 years ago, and that shouldn't happen. Because everything we believe about materials says newer means stronger, cleaner means better, more advanced means more reliable. And yet, there are pieces of ancient iron that have been left outside for centuries, exposed to rain, cold, time itself. And when you pick them up today, they don't break the way modern metal does. They don't fracture clean. They don't snap without warning. Instead, they tear, slowly, as if something inside them is still holding the structure together, even as it's coming apart. Which doesn't make sense, because older iron should be weaker, more brittle, easier to break. And yet, something inside it changes that. Because when you look closer at the fracture, it doesn't look solid at all. It looks fibrous, like thin strands stretched through the metal, layered, uneven, almost as if the iron was built in lines, instead of cast into form. And that's where things start to feel off. Because modern steel is engineered to be perfectly uniform, every part behaving the same way, predictable, controlled. But this older iron isn't uniform at all. It's inconsistent, full of irregularities. And somehow, those imperfections seem to interrupt cracks, to slow them down, to force the metal to resist failure instead of collapsing all at once, which raises a quiet question, one that almost no one talks about anymore. Were these blacksmiths trying to make stronger iron, or were they unknowingly creating a structure we still don't fully understand? Because resisting cracks isn't even the strangest part, but the way this iron resists breaking isn't even the strangest part. Because when you put it under repeated stress, something unexpected begins to happen. The damage doesn't spread the way it should. It slows down. It hesitates. Almost as if the material itself is interfering with the failure. And that's where things start to feel wrong. Because in modern steel, once a crack begins, it moves fast. Clean, predictable, a straight path from weakness to collapse. But in this older iron, the crack doesn't behave like that at all. It twists, it shifts direction, it gets caught, redirected, broken into smaller paths that seem to fight against each other, which means the energy doesn't release all at once. It leaks out slowly, unevenly, more like tearing fabric than snapping glass. And that difference changes everything, because it turns failure from a single moment into a process. And yet, when you compare it directly, modern steel is still stronger on paper, harder, more refined, more controlled, designed to handle higher loads with precision. And in most cases, it does exactly that. But when it finally reaches its limit, it often fails without warning. A sudden break, a clean fracture, no resistance once the threshold is crossed, which creates a contradiction that's hard to ignore. The material that is technically better behaves worse when it matters most. There are even cases where old iron structures, exposed to constant vibration or repeated stress, didn't collapse the way modern replacements sometimes do. Not because they were stronger, but because the damage inside them never fully aligned, never formed that single clean path needed for sudden failure. And that's where those internal fibers begin to matter more than they should. Because they don't reinforce the iron evenly. They complicate it. They break uniformity. And in doing so, they force stress to behave differently, to scatter, to slow, to hesitate, which leads to a question that feels a little uncomfortable. If perfection creates clean failure, then what exactly did we lose when we removed all the imperfections? And this is where the story begins to shift. Because the more you look at that fibrous structure, the less it feels like a property of the metal, and the more it starts to feel like a trace of the people who made it. This kind of iron wasn't designed on paper. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't optimized. It was shaped slowly, through repetition, through heat, through force, through hands that worked the same material again and again, adjusting, watching, feeling, without ever fully explaining why. And that's where something becomes difficult to ignore. Because we assume knowledge lives in books, but for most of history, it didn't. It lived in hands, in habits, in movements repeated so many times. They stopped being conscious decisions. A blacksmith didn't need to understand stress or fracture mechanics, but he could feel when the iron resisted differently. He could see when it behaved in a way that didn't match expectation. And over time, those small observations became instinct, quiet adjustments, made without words, without theory. And maybe that's where these internal fibers began to form, not as a deliberate design, but as the result of a process that responded to the material, instead of forcing it into uniformity. Stretching impurities, layering structure, building something that wasn't clean, but wasn't simple either. And yet, as production changed, that process started to fade, because consistency became more valuable than variation. Predictability became the goal, and slowly, the human element was removed, replaced by systems that could produce identical results every time, which sounds like progress, until you notice what's missing. Because something about this older iron suggests that imperfection wasn't just tolerated, it was doing something important. Because those blacksmiths weren't chasing perfection. They were working with what the material gave them, adjusting, responding, allowing irregularities to remain. And in doing so, they may have been creating a kind of resilience that doesn't come from strength alone, but from complexity. So the question lingers: if that knowledge was never written down, never fully explained, then how much of it disappeared the moment those hands were no longer there to repeat it? And this is where the story becomes harder to ignore. Because if that kind of resilience came from imperfection, then what we lost wasn't just a technique, it was a way of thinking. Because modern materials are built for precision, for control, for consistency, every variable reduced, every outcome predicted, and most of the time, that works. It gives us strength, efficiency, scale, but it also creates something else. A system where failure is clean, sudden, absolute, no warning, no resistance once the limit is reached. And that's the part that feels a little unsettling. Because this older iron doesn't fail that way. It resists, it slows, it stretches the moment of collapse. Not by being perfect, but by being uneven, which suggests something deeper. That resilience doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from complexity, from irregularity, from structures that aren't fully controlled. And maybe that's the trade-off we don't often talk about. Because in removing imperfections, we didn't just remove flaws. We removed interruption. We removed the small irregularities that force systems to slow down, to adapt, to resist collapse just a little longer. And that idea doesn't just stay in metal. You can see it in systems, in designs, even in the way we build things today. Perfect systems behave exactly as expected, until they don't. And when they fail completely. No hesitation, no second chance. While imperfect systems sometimes hold longer than they should, sometimes bend instead of break, sometimes survive in ways that don't make immediate sense, which leaves a question that doesn't really have a clean answer. If we've spent so much time chasing perfection, why do some of the things built without it still outlast us? Because in the end, perfect systems break perfectly.